everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with our weekly update on social media. Thanks for joining us this week. Another huge week for Judicial Watch. Our heavy lifting exposed the infamous affidavit behind the infamous Biden operation raid on the home of former President Trump. I'll talk about what that raid or what that affidavit shows and how the media has been targeting Judicial Watch because of our leadership on the issue. Secondly, we've got this new big lawsuit over this racist contract policy that gives special treatment to teachers based on race in Minneapolis. I'll talk about that. Again, a cutting-edge lawsuit, a national lawsuit from Judicial Watch, or at least a lawsuit that has national implications. First up, though, is an update for you special from Judicial Watch, who is in the middle of it on the Biden raid on President Trump. Now, Judicial Watch, as soon as the raid happened, as I talked about last week, we leapt into action to try to get access to the information behind the raid, namely the warrant and any supporting information used to justify the raid. And of course, the Biden operation, despite doing something so obviously abusive, so obviously political, so obviously unprecedented, had zero interest in disclosing anything. So we made the court filing. Then the big media came in after us, and they agreed with Judicial Watch, by the way, so we're on the same side as organizations like the New York Times in demanding this transparency. They also demanded that this material be unsealed. Unsealed means the court has granted a motion by the Justice Department to keep the records away from the public. And the court reacted, to its credit, quickly and ordered the Justice Department to respond. And within a few days, after stalling and hemming and hawing, and virtual silence practically from the Justice Department, Attorney General Garland caved and released the warrant, which of course wasn't enough. And you just can't have a little bit of transparency and not a more fulsome disclosure. And so we kept on fighting, and the court obviously already had an order demanding that the Justice Department respond, or giving the Justice Department an opportunity to respond to our request for disclosure. And the Justice Department came in and said, oh, it should all be redacted. And the court said, no, it shouldn't all be redacted. And long story short, he ordered in response to Judicial Watch's request, he ordered the Justice Department to file a partially redacted document. And it was released. It was just released just a few hours before I'm talking to you now. And the document, it's historic because never before has the president's home been raided. And it's very difficult typically to get affidavits like this out in any timely way, but Judicial Watch did it. And obviously the public has an intense interest that outweighs any alleged interest that the Justice Department was pretending to have in keeping this material completely secret. And now we know why they wanted to keep it secret. Because yes, we were right. There was no good faith basis to raid the president's home. Yes, we were right. They were using the pretext wrongly of the Presidential Records Act and suggesting that the president had classified records on his premises when in fact they were all unclassified to raid his home. This is weak tea. This affidavit shows that the raid on Trump's home was a raid about nothing. Indeed, the documents show that the Presidential Records Act was the genesis of this raid. When you look at the Presidential Records Act, as I went through carefully with you previously, there is no enforcement mechanism. It's the discretion of the president to decide what's presidential versus what's personal. And by presidential, that means records that are classified. So any record he sees at the White House potentially is classified, and the Presidential Records Act gives him the ability to take that with him and presumptively declassify them automatically as a result. And no one can second guess him in that regard. That's what a court found in a case that Judicial Watch had pursued against Bill Clinton, because we had pursued initially the Justice Department's new legal theory that, hey, Bill Clinton had records after he left the Oval Office. And it looks like they might be presidential records. It looks like they might even be classified presidential records. And the Justice Department came back to us and said, no, you have no right to get these records. And the court agreed. And yet they changed their minds when it came to targeting Trump. And it was obviously pretextual. And everyone who's looked at this affidavit will see, and I encourage you to read it. It's heavily redacted, but there's a lot more here than you might have thought would have been unredacted. So there's some substantial material here. And they're pretending that the records the president he didn't have a right to have. The Presidential Records Act. And they cite someone saw boxes at Mar-a-Lago, as if that's a basis to raid a president's home. And because he voluntarily turned back records that the archives had alleged were presidential records, and I don't think he had to do that, or frankly, the archives was right in that regard. And the archives went through the boxes and said, well, some of these records are marked classified. Well, that doesn't matter because they were his. And he had the right to declassify them. And in fact, he did because he had them at his home. That was the theory of law that the Justice Department said if the president had these records after he left, presumptively they're personal, meaning presumptively they're declassified. And yet they went and they got the judge to approve this warrant. And what's interesting in the affidavit, they acknowledge that there was a dispute. Kash Patel talked about how the records were declassified. There's a lawyer at the end, there's a letter at the end of the document that is written by the president's lawyer asserting his constitutional prerogatives in having these records. So I don't understand why the court, when looking at this material, they see the Justice Department is alleging these records are classified. He sees the president is alleging these records are mine. They are declassified and I have a right to have them. Why it is he would have just said, you know what, there's a dispute here that I'm not going to allow you to raid a president's home until this dispute is resolved in a more clear way. I'm not in a position to judge constitutionally which records are whose, whether they're government records and classified or what President Trump is saying that they're declassified and he has rights under the Presidential Records Act. So I don't think the judge should have signed on to it, but certainly that the Justice Department did a complete 180 and changed their legal position and changed the rules midstream to go after Trump is a wild abuse of power, as I've said. And so I just want to clarify here, though. It is Judicial Watch that got access to this affidavit. And it wasn't disclosed voluntarily by the Justice Department. We had to go to court to force it out. And this is a major victory for transparency. And I encourage you, now that we have the information, to go and review it. And my understanding of the media reaction to this, not that that's the end all and be all, is they tend to agree with me here. It's weak tea. There's not much basis here for the outrageous step of raiding a former president's home just a few months before an election. You know what it was about. It was about finding a reason to harass President Trump, try to jail him, and try to prosecute him. And they misused the law, misstated the law, and in my view, improperly got a judge to approve a warrant that had no good faith basis. And I want to talk again about this Clinton case because the CNN had a story this week, and their report was that 3 people somehow knew about conversations that I allegedly had with President Trump about this very issue. And the 3 people who obviously weren't party to the conversations that I allegedly have, that CNN ran with it anyway, even though I refused to confirm or deny anything I may or may not have said to President Trump, and certainly President Trump didn't leak this. They said that Tom Fitton was the one who convinced Trump to hide the records. First of all, I've never, my public statements on this have been quite clear. If the president wanted to turn over records because they might be better secured, because they're too important to be at his home, they might be better secured by the archives or the government, or the archives wanted some historical records that were his, but under the Presidential Records Act, but he just decided to let them have them because he wanted the American people to know what was more about his presidency. That's a far cry from me saying hide the records. No, it's defend your rights. So when they say that the president had records in violation of the law, he should have, and he should reject that very notion. All of these records are his. All of them are personal, at least the way the Justice Department used to think about the law. And I talked to you about this case, and it's worth reiterating because, you know, the left media is all excited about the fact that I may or may not have talked to President Trump about this issue. But they didn't want to talk about as much whether my public statements about what the law is and how it should apply are correct. And it's worth reiterating what a district court judge here in Washington, D.C. found when she looked at information that was kept by Bill Clinton, tapes of conversations he had with foreign leaders and doing other government business. And we had seen initially, hey, they're presidential records, as I've said. And the court came back and said, no, you can't force the archives to do anything about this. And she explained what the law was. And the law is, according to her, and this is Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who's one of the more liberal judges here in the District Court of the District of Columbia. And she did this at the request, by the way, of the archives, that now's done a completely, now's pretending this decision doesn't exist. I want you to listen to this and you think, and ask yourself if you think her analysis would allow this raid to have taken place. Quote from the judge: under the statutory scheme established by the Presidential Records Act, the decision to segregate personal materials from presidential records is made by the president during the president's term and in his sole discretion. So NARA, the National Archives, could not make a classification decision different from that of the president. Again, since the president is completely entrusted with the management and even the disposal of presidential records, you hear that? Disposal, during his time in office, it would be difficult for this court to conclude that Congress intended that he would have less authority to do what he pleases with what he considers to be his personal records. Again, the Presidential Records Act contains no provision obligating or even permitting the archives to assume control over records that the president categorized and filed separately as personal records. At the conclusion of the president's term, the archivist only assumes responsibility for the presidential records, meaning the ones that they know have been sent over to them as presidential records. Plaintiff, Judicial Watch, contends that its factual allegations about the nature and substance of the audio tapes at issue clearly establishes them to be presidential records, regardless of how they were treated by President Clinton. The court is not so sure. But even if the court were inclined to agree with our reassessment of President Clinton's decision, it would not alter the conclusion that the injury cannot be redressed. And this is the kicker. The Presidential Records Act does not confer any mandatory or even discretionary authority on the archivist to classify records. Under this statute, the responsibility is left solely to the president. While the plaintiff casts this lawsuit as a challenge to a decision made by the National Archives, the Presidential Records Act makes it clear that this is not a decision the archivist can make. And in this particular case, it is not a decision the archivist did make because President Clinton's term ended in 2000 and the tapes were not provided to the archives at this time. So there you have it. A court decision that quite persuasively, we lost. We lost this, so we know what the law is. You know, we generally know what the law is because we're in litigation, but we really know what the law is when we lose a lawsuit because you never like to lose. And we lost this one. And here you have a district court judge interpreting an appellate court decision that was the guiding decision for the government's handling of presidential records and saying, no way the archives can come in and get these records. No way. There's no enforcement mechanism. And yet they went ahead and pretended there was. And they concocted and told a judge, in my view, misled a judge, that he had the authority under law to authorize a warrant to get presidential records. And don't be distracted by the fact that there were so-called classified records in the boxes that weren't presidential records. Classified records are a subset of presidential records. So if he thinks they're personal, it means they're already declassified. There was no authority for the Justice Department to ask a judge to authorize a subpoena to enforce the Presidential Records Act. And obviously, the judge had no authority to implement or approve a warrant that had no basis in law. That's what happened here. So this affidavit, by the way, is evidence of abuse of authority, abuse of power, and government corruption. And I'm glad Judicial Watch got it out. And once again, this affidavit and these documents further confirm just how dishonest the Justice Department is. I talked about how in this case, they refused to go after Clinton records. Well, are they now going to go after Clinton records? I doubt it. Of course, you know, they're not going to do anything like that. And how they refused to do anything similar against Hillary Clinton. This is what they wrote in the document. One of my colleagues pointed this out to me in the Trump warrant. 184 unique documents bearing classification markings were within the 15 boxes that Trump's legal team returned to the government earlier this year. Of those, 67 documents were marked as confidential, 92 marked as secret, and 25 marked as top secret. Now, just because they're marked, as I said, doesn't mean they're classified. If they're declassified, those markings are artifacts, right? It's an historical artifact. This is a record that previously had been classified, but because it was in President Trump's possession after he left the Oval Office and he had taken them with him out of the White House, they were presumptively declassified. That's the law. And this is what Comey said about Hillary. From the group of 30,000 emails returned to the State Department by her, 110 emails and 52 email chains had been determined by the owning agency to contain classified information at the time they were sent or received. 8 of those chains contained classified information that was top secret at the time they were sent. 36 chains contained classified information, secret information, at the time, and 8 contained confidential information, which is the lowest level of classification. So Hillary had 110 classified emails, chains. Trump allegedly had 184. Of course, the big difference is that Trump had a right to those records, and he had declassification authority under the Presidential Records Act. And none of this was declassified by Hillary while she was there. Certainly, she had no authority to declassify them after she left. Yet, Trump's home was raided, and Hillary was treated with kid gloves. Dramatic evidence of corruption. So it's, again, your Judicial Watch taking the lead. The left is upset that Judicial Watch and I am telling the truth about the sham basis of this abusive raid on President Trump. Sham basis. There is no good faith basis. Now, allegedly, there are people around Trump who leaked my alleged conversations with President Trump. I don't know what they're up to. I don't know who CNN talked to. But I do know what the truth is. And the truth is that President Trump had a right to these records. The Justice Department's interpretation of the law, the Archives' interpretation of the law, and more importantly, the court's interpretation of the law said he had a right to these records, and they pretended he didn't and played games with the court to get this abusive raid on him. Incredible. Incredible. And this is the same FBI that's protecting Hunter Biden, protecting Joe Biden. Remember, this raid came shortly after it was disclosed by whistleblowers that the FBI had suppressed and buried an investigation of Hunter Biden's laptop just before the election. And sure enough, this week, we have more information about the FBI's subversion of our Republican form of government, where you had Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook essentially admitting that the FBI came in and said, oh, watch out, there's going to be Russian disinformation being dumped. And sure enough, the Hunter laptop comes out, and Zuckerberg says, well, this is what they must have meant. And so he suppressed it. His Facebook suppressed it just before the election. So you had the FBI obstructing its own investigations and censoring Americans and trying to pressure big media, big tech to censor Americans about the Hunter Biden laptop just before the election. And then they go and raid this poor man's home, President Trump, based on nothing, a document dispute. I was shocked by it. You know, that's one of the reasons I get outraged, because I genuinely expect people to do the right thing. And it's surprising to me and disappointing and outrageous when they don't. I'm outraged because I'm an optimist who often has to meet reality in my work here at Judicial Watch. So that's where I get this outrage from. It's because I'm an optimist. And it's upsetting to see people that you hope would do the right thing and you would expect do the right thing, don't. And in this case, the FBI is in a moral and ethical collapse, and they can't be trusted to tie their shoes, let alone raid, do something as sensitive as concoct or manufacture a reason in working with the deep state DOJ, the Biden operation that's running the DOJ, the anti-Trump activists at the archives who thought that they could get the FBI involved because they wanted documents for history that they had a right to, but the law didn't allow them to get. Completely, it's kind of this hijacking of our Republican form of government and our separation of powers that protect all of our liberty by these bureaucrats and these political appointees. And of course, Judicial Watch will now consider whether or not, and this is something our lawyers are taking a look at, what are we going to do about these redactions, huh? What do you think we should do? Should we just let them sit? I don't think we're going to do that. I get to play client as corporate representative for Judicial Watch, as president of Judicial Watch. So I'm going to encourage some type of effort to try to get more access to this information. You know, it's important to remember that our leadership forced the release of this affidavit, but there's more to be done. As I noted, it's a remarkable and historic victory for transparency that Judicial Watch today was able to get out this affidavit, which obviously is infamous in nature. And we now know why the Biden Justice Department, as I've been explaining, did not want to release this material, as it exposes how there was significant evidence that President Trump cooperated and that there was a major legal dispute about the status of the records believed to be in Trump's possession. And yet the FBI abusively raided his home anyway. And, it's one thing to have these redactions in the affidavit, and one thing you need to figure out as we're deciding what to do about it is, well, why is it they redacted it? Well, the Biden Justice Department, their dishonest redactions include redactions of the reasons for the redactions. That's your government at work. And of course, that just makes a mockery of the American people's right to know about this FBI raid, which is unprecedented and destabilized the country. So we're pushing hard, not only in this case, but as I've discussed before, we filed several Freedom of Information Act requests for the disputes behind the raid on Trump's home, including a request to the National Archives for records about their communications back in February 2022 or shortly before then that resulted in the initial transfer back to the archives or to the archives from President Trump of some of these documents. Now, of course, they didn't want to give us any of those documents. So this National Archives, which is telling us that we have to enforce the law when it comes to the handling of government documents, refuses to follow law when it comes to transparency for the American people. We asked for these documents back in February, by the way. February. We knew something was up from the get-go. All records regarding the referral from the National Archives to the Department of Justice regarding the records management procedures of former President Trump. This requests all related records of any communication between any official or employee of the archives and any official or employee of the Justice Department or any other branch, department, agency, or office of the federal government. That includes the White House there. All records regarding the retrieval of records from President Trump or any individual or entity acting on his behalf by the National Archives and Records Administration. This request includes related records of communications between any official or employee of NARA and the President Trump or any individual or entity acting on his behalf. We want the full truth. The Biden administration's raid on President Trump's home, as I keep on saying, and I'll say it once, and I'll say it until I'm unable to say it anymore. It's outrageous, reckless, and an unprecedented abuse of power. And the American people have an urgent right to know how the Biden administration manufactured the records dispute used as a pretext for the raid on Trump's home. And the Biden administration's unlawful secrecy on its political raid of Trump's home speaks volumes. So if you think everything's on the up and up, why are you hiding records from us? Why do you want to redact everything? Why are you pretending that there are essentially state secrets at issue when in fact you know there aren't? You think you should be able to raid the president's home without fully disclosing a basis for it? Of course not. The American people have a right to judge how the federal judicial system is operating and how the Justice Department that's entrusted, I don't think it should be trusted, but it is entrusted under law with enforcing the law. I don't know about you, but I don't trust this Biden administration, and I don't trust any Justice Department, frankly, under any administration these days, given the corruption that we've seen, or the FBI, to fairly administer justice. So that's why we have a new FOIA lawsuit in addition to our historic transparency legal battle in Florida for the Trump raid material. And we'll see what they're hiding. The battle for transparency has just begun. So what I love about Judicial Watch is that we have this wonderful work, this historic work we're doing on transparency related to the Biden political raid, political attack on Trump's home. And but it doesn't mean we give up on other important issues that are similarly important to our country and the rule of law. And along those lines, we have been second to none in pursuing justice, exposing the radical nature, and trying to stop the critical race theory agenda that is anti-American, Marxist, and frankly, out to destroy the theory, the constitutional principle that everyone, no matter their race, deserves equal protection of the law. And that you can't deny someone equal protection of the law based on race. And the left used to pretend that they believed in this, right? They were the civil rights left, right? And it was the awful conservatives who were all terribly racist, when in fact it turns out the truth is something different. Conservatives and everyday Americans, people who can call themselves conservative or people who don't even think about politics the way someone like me does, they inherently understand that the government should treat people equally, no matter their race. The left rejects that. Example, Judicial Watch files taxpayer lawsuit over racially discriminatory Minneapolis school contract, teacher's contract. We announced that we filed a lawsuit on behalf of a taxpayer against the teachers over a teacher's contract provision that provides discriminatory job protections to certain racial minorities. We filed it against the superintendent of the schools out there, the school district generally, the Minneapolis Public Schools, and the Board of Education for the state. And we say, we allege, under this taxpayer lawsuit, that it violates the Minnesota Constitution's equal protection guarantee, which essentially is the same, legally speaking, as our Constitution's 14th Amendment, which also provides equal protections under the law. The controversial contract was agreed to in March 2022 to end a 14-day teacher strike. So this is something that was part, the teachers union, which evidently is far to the left because they promote this, wanted. The Federation of Teachers in the state ratified the contract shortly after the agreement was reached, and the Board of Education ratified it in May of this year. So here you have the union ratifying a contract that specifically endorses and allows for race discrimination against union members based on their race. And then you have it ratified by government. And we sued to vindicate the rule of law here and stop it. This is the text of the lawsuit in part. Among other things, the contract provides preferences, protection, and privileges for teachers of certain races and ethnicities under a section entitled Article 15, Protections for Educators of Color. There is no similar provision covering educators who are not of color. Under the contract, teachers of color are exempt from the school district's seniority-based layoffs and reassignments, which means when layoffs or reassignments occur, the next senior teacher who is not of color would be laid off or reassigned. In addition, the contract mandates that defendants reinstate teachers of color over more senior teachers who are not of color. Upon information and belief, prior to the contract, teachers were laid off or reassigned in order of seniority, with the least senior teachers laid off or reassigned first without regard to race or ethnicity. Similarly, teachers were reinstated in order of seniority, with the more senior teachers reinstated first without regard to race or ethnicity. Article 15's preferences, this is the discrimination article, protections and privileges for certain public school teachers on the basis of race and ethnicity violates Minnesota's Equal Protection Guarantee, which states that no member of this state shall be disenfranchised or deprived of any of the rights or privileges secured to any citizen thereof, unless by the law of the land or the judgment of his peers. The Equal Protection Guarantee is analyzed under the same principles and mandate as the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So what we're doing is that we're asking on behalf of our taxpayer client, so Minnesota has this, legal principle that taxpayers can sue to stop illegal activity by the government, including race discrimination. That's so blatant here, it's just astonishing. So we're entering a judgment that will declare that all the actions taken to implement the racial and ethnic preference provisions of the Article 15 of the contract be illegal. We're also asking that the court declare it illegal to use any taxpayer dollars to implement these provisions of the contract, and that the defendants be prohibited from taking any actions to implement these racial and ethnic provisions. You know, and as I say, it's incredible that in this day and age, we have to sue a school system over its blatant disregard for the rule of law and its blatant racial discrimination in employing teachers. I mean, they think they should be able to engage in naked race discrimination in removing teachers because of layoffs or hiring them back. I mean, what's going on here? And of course, the left was highlighting this contract as a national model. So this is why this lawsuit is also important. The courts can't move soon enough to shut down this extreme leftist attack on the bedrock constitutional principle that no one can be denied equal treatment under law on account of race. Judicial Watch has become America's #1 civil rights organization in terms of vindicating and protecting the rule of law that prohibits racial discrimination. And who are the worst offenders? Who are the worst threats to the rule of law protecting you and yours from race discrimination? Everyone from race discrimination? The left. We had a case in Asheville, North Carolina. There was the city there had set up a school program or school scholarship program funded with tax dollars that only allowed minorities to apply. Outrageously racially discriminatory. We sued. The city said, okay, you're right, we're turning it off. California, you had mandates based on race, based on sexual identity, ethnicity, quota mandates based on gender for corporate boards of directors. We sued, 2 lawsuits. We won both. Completely discriminatory requirements. I mean, the left is engaged in a full national assault on the rule of law as it relates to equal protections under our Constitution and the relevant state versions of those protections. This is dangerous. They want to divide the country by race and specifically provide certain benefits to certain members, certain races, and no benefits to others, or punish other races. It's crazy. And I say crazy, it's malicious, because they know what they're doing. In the case of Asian Americans, who in some circumstances are treated as minorities, and other circumstances are treated as targets by the left to be discriminated against in school admissions, whether they be in Harvard or in, as I was talking about a few weeks ago, a big high school, leading high school, the leading high school in the country, just outside of Washington, D.C. The left looked at the makeup of the high school, said there were too many Asians in it, and they changed the rules to ensure they get discriminated against. The radical left, and of course this is all critical race theory, by the way, because they think the current non-discrimination system that's in place under the Constitution, that's in place under the Civil Rights Act, and it's, the various similar civil rights laws, they're all a tool of white supremacy to to oppress minorities. They don't believe in laws against racial discrimination, and they want to blow it up and make government the divider of races. It's revolutionary, it's Marxist, it's anti-American, and Judicial Watch is doing its darndest to stop it. And that's why we've got this important lawsuit in Minnesota on behalf of taxpayers to vindicate the rule of law, because if this contract gets through and is allowed to proceed and is upheld, we're going to have all sorts of contracts throughout the country that provide special favors to people based on race. What a terrible thing that would be for the country and the rule of law and the American way. And another major issue is the assault on America under the guise of COVID restrictions by local. Everyone's been talking about how Dr. Fauci is resigning, I think in large measure thanks to Judicial Watch's litigation and disclosures detailing his dishonesty about the Wuhan lab, his funding of the Wuhan lab's gain-of-function research, the mendacity related to that by him and his colleagues and the agencies generally he was responsible for, and plus lawsuits about his finances and other things he was up to at NIH. It's no surprise to me he's retiring. But Fauci, I know, is blamed by many for a lot of these shutdowns, and he deserves significant blame. But in the end, legally, it was the local governments, state governments, that were responsible for the shutdowns that have done so much damage. As I call them, a public health experiment without precedent in world history, let alone American history. And of course, all these schools faced restrictions and COVID restrictions and such. And parents got fed up and they wanted to know what was going on. They wanted their kids back in school. It was the worst of all worlds. You had the internet schooling and being at home and deprived of effective education. It was a disaster for children, the shutdown of schools, and parents saw it firsthand and grew increasingly concerned as it just went on and on and on, despite the lack of science supporting the massive shutdowns on schools. So I could go on and on about why the COVID lockdowns and all these COVID policies were just kind of just made up as they went along. They came up with the science after the fact. But parents got active. And one of the ways they got active, they saw that their kids were being taught, and they wanted to know details about the critical race theory and the transgender extremist agenda and other activities that the schools were teaching without concern for parental views on this. So you saw this new political activism at the school board level. And tied into that was the concern about the shutdown of schools of COVID. And the left got very angry, and these school boards and local government officials got very angry when all these parents frankly saw what Judicial Watch was able to do through FOIA, and they said, we'll use FOIA to figure out what our schools are up to. And then, of course, the left got angry. Oh, you're weaponizing FOIA. You're weaponizing your First Amendment rights to petition your government. That's the way the left considers. That's how much disdain they have for your rights as a citizen. And sure enough, in Bucks County, there was a leader, a parental leader, Megan Brock, who had been adamant that there was something up with the way the school shutdowns had been handled in her jurisdiction in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And so she was requesting documents. Tell me what was going on here under law. And you know what Bucks County did? They sued her. They sued her for asking questions. She sought these records under FOIA. Her FOIA request was allowed to go forward. And so Bucks County sued this parent for asking the questions in court. And Judicial Watch is proud to announce that we are providing her legal representation. She's being sued by Bucks County, Pennsylvania, to prevent the release of documents she requested under the Commonwealth's right to know law that are related to COVID restrictions and the reopening of the county's schools. Bucks County filed multiple lawsuits against Brock to prevent the release of documents after the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records found in Brock's favor and ordered Bucks County to search for and release the documents in two right-to-know requests she had pursued. She had sent a February request back in 2022, back in February of this year, asking for all electronic correspondence by the Director of Policy and Communications at Bucks County with the board vice chair and the board chair and the former director of the Commissioner's Office of Public Information and the chief clerk and the health department director, basically the leadership of Bucks County, about the school guidance related to COVID. And then she sent another request on this school guidance. So she wanted details about the complete school guidance document. And for daring to ask those questions, she was sued. So last month, we filed an answer to Bucks County's lawsuits against Brock. So we're honored to represent her. And, our client, Megan Brock, and other parents won't be intimidated by Bucks County government's abuse of the lawsuit process in order to thwart basic information requests. And as I say in the release, our client, Megan Brock, and other parents won't be intimidated by Bucks County government's abusive lawsuits designed to thwart basic information requests about what they're up to. And we're honored to represent a concerned parent being punished through lawfare for daring to demand accountability from her local government. Now, National Review had a story on what Megan Brock was up to. She and another parent, Jamie Walker, led the fight to reopen the county schools during the pandemic. And then they didn't want the schools to be closed again. And they wanted, once the schools to be open, to actually be teaching in a normal fashion as opposed to having all these crazy COVID rules that, in my view, were vindictive and abusive. So they suspected, and this is kind of the basis, it looks like, for some of the FOIA requests, that county officials and two Democratic commissioners had a hand in updating the county's guidance on COVID and the schools and possibly overruling their own health director, a strong advocate for in-person learning. So there was like what was going on? Was one government official saying, we got to open these schools, and were the leftists in the government saying, no, you got to keep them closed? They believe Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf's administration also coerced the county into adopting its more restrictive COVID policies and its one-size-fits-all approach to school reopening. So this is just great, because this mom, this activist, this citizen is doing the right thing. This is what we want all citizens to do, isn't it? And I'm not saying all citizens have to do it, but the idea that a citizen that uses the law to figure out what their local government is up to gets punished with a lawsuit is just outrageous. And if there's anything we can do to help someone like that, and we've got the capacity and all things come together, we're going to help. And we're honored to help Megan Brock here. And I hope it affirms anyone else who's listening that they have a right to know about what their government's up to at the local, state, and federal levels. And all of these FOIA laws, all these transparency laws I'm talking about, you can use personally to try to figure out what the government's up to. Now, the downside is, in the case of her, she got sued. The government can come in and sue a requester in order to protect themselves from having to release documents. But generally speaking, you can ask for documents and you can get them sometimes, especially at the local level. So I encourage you to research your local FOIA laws. Go to the agency you're interested in, see what their right to know procedures and policies are, and follow them and ask questions about things that you're interested in. You have a right to do that, and we encourage you to do that. Because you can bet the politicians aren't going to do much in the way of oversight. You can bet the media isn't going to do much in the way of oversight. It's up to you to be vigilant. So with that, you can see that Judicial Watch is just phenomenal. I love Judicial Watch. I love Judicial Watch not because I'm its president. It's because I know as a patriot we're doing essential work for our nation, whether it be taking the lead and being the target of attack for taking the lead and exposing the outrageous Biden abuse of President Trump with this illegal raid, taking on the radical left agenda in Minnesota that has come up with this outrageous public school teachers contract that treats teachers according to race, and their jobs are on the line based on their race as opposed to, non-race-based issues. And then, of course, we're representing this mom up in Pennsylvania who's being sued for daring to ask questions why her schools are being shut down over this COVID mania. And I dare say it, there's no one else doing that type of work. As I said, we're the leading group when it comes to government, combating government corruption, exposing what the government's up to, defending the rule of law, and defending civil rights properly understood. We're the #1 government watchdog in the country by far. And we're only able to do this work with your support, and I encourage you to support our work. Read the information I'm telling you to find out about. It's all on our website at judicialwatch.org, but also support our work directly with your most generous contribution. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I'll see you here next week on the Judicial Watch Weekly Update. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.